Before we get into the details of Prime's approach to additionality, um, um, let me just give you some relevant background on who I am and why I'm speaking to you. I am Director of Impact Research Evaluation and Learning at the Wharton Impact Value and Sustainable Business Initiative. There's sort of a center within a center there called the Impact Investing Research Lab. That's where I do most of my work. But in addition to that, I have an independent consulting practice and have worked as a consultant with a variety of social impact organizations, including Prime Coalition. So I was engaged by Prime back in August of 2023 to help inform their catalytic capital field building strategy. And for the next year and a half, I worked with Prime on that priority. And one of the outputs of that consulting engagement is this case study that Impact Frontiers has published. So that's the connection between me and Prime and this case study. And let me just say that it's very gratifying to be able to talk about this document as a finished product after all the work that went into it, not only for me, but also from my colleagues at Prime. With that background, let me just quickly address additionality. It's likely that all of you know what additionality is, but it's a complex and somewhat fraught topic in impact investing. And so I think it would be helpful to just clarify what we mean by it at the outset. We should recognize, first of all, that I think as we just heard from Mike's opening, Impact Frontiers often uses a synonym for additionality, which is investor contribution. I'm not going to get into a semantic rabbit hole here. I just want to say that essentially investor contribution is the same thing as additionality, and Impact Frontiers defines it as follows in one of its position papers. Investor actions that cause or are expected to cause a change in outcomes for end stakeholders, the natural environment, and or systematic risk that would not have likely occurred in the absence of those actions. So basically, additionality or investor contribution occurs when impact investors go where other investors don't go or invest in ways that other investors do not, and in doing so, achieve impact that we have good reason to believe would not otherwise happen. Now, there are different ways to achieve and document additionality, and this case study obviously showcases how Prime specifically does that. So a bit of background on the organization itself. Prime Coalition is a nonprofit organization founded in 2014 by Sarah Carney. The organization partners with philanthropists and mission-focused investors to de-risk and accelerate high-impact climate solutions, ideally so that conventional capital can follow and continue to scale these technologies and solutions. They do this through three strategic pillars: catalytic investing, knowledge sharing, and technical advising. Since its founding, Prime has mobilized over $315 million for climate solutions, but what makes them particularly interesting for our discussion today is that additionality isn't just one criterion among many for Prime, it's really the animating principle of the entire organization. Now, the case study goes into more detail on this point, but it suffices to say here that additionality is absolutely central to what Prime does. It's woven into all of the organization's decision making, and it's particularly evident in Prime's catalytic capital investing work. And just to clarify, by catalytic capital, I mean investments that accept disproportionate risk or concessionary returns in order to achieve additionality. Prime uses catalytic capital to achieve three key mechanisms that enable additionality. First is risk mitigation. Their capital can absorb first losses or provide guarantees that make investments more attractive to conventional investors. Second is demonstration effect. So by proving the viability of new technologies or business models, they pave the way for future commercial investment. And third is flexibility. They can provide longer investment horizons or more patient capital than conventional investors typically offer. Now, these three approaches have matured and developed somewhat over more than a decade, from the early deal-by-deal syndication to dedicated funds, but they have remained central to what Prime does throughout. Now, it's important to differentiate two sort of levels of analysis here. One level is the program level, which is, for example, Prime's like dedicated impact funds, Prime Impact Fund, Azola Ventures, Trellis Climate. And then there's the level of individual investments within those programs. So investments that, for example, Azola makes into a particular enterprise that aligns with Azola's impact thesis. And I bring up these two levels because Prime has different conventions and processes for thinking about and assessing additionality at the program level and at the investment level. And hopefully this will become a bit more intuitive as I get into more of the details. So how does Prime make the case for additionality? So I'm going to start with the program level, which is really anchored by a 7-phase process illustrated here. So we have hypothesize, substantiate, design, construct, fundraise, implement, and evaluate. All of these 7 phases are important, but 3 are particularly important for establishing additionality: substantiate, design, and construct. So I'll just touch on these 3 really briefly. In the substantiate phase, Prime builds a case for the existence and nature of a particular capital gap, an evidence-based case. So for example, with Trellis Climate, they conducted extensive research involving interviews with over 140 senior members of the climate ecosystem. And this research demonstrated a clear lack of capital for commercializing novel climate infrastructure, specifically for engineering studies, site development, and permitting that needs to happen before construction financing. These findings were published in this report, Barriers to Timely Deployment of Climate Infrastructure, which essentially functioned as substantiation of a specific capital gap. So it was the key result of the substantiate phase. During the design phase, these findings on the capital gap and on opportunities for achieving additionality are built into a program structure. So this includes identifying a mission-driven impact-first team and experimenting with various investment structures that are best suited to addressing the capital gap. And then in the construct phase, this is all put into practice. Additionality gets baked into the legal and operational framework. So for example, by including impact-focused covenants in fund formation documents. So that's a high-level overview of establishing additionality for an overarching program. Now let's talk about assessing additionality for individual investments during that implementation phase. Here, Prime uses a two-pronged approach. First, they gather expert input through an investment advisory committee, or IAC. So this is a committee comprised of experienced professionals who evaluate whether a given company carries disproportionately high risks that would deter conventional investors. And just to clarify, this quality of carrying disproportionate risk is not necessarily a negative. It's actually a positive if that company also offers outsized impact along with a degree of commercial viability. Because again, Prime's mission is to identify and support high impact climate solutions that are likely to be overlooked by conventional investors. That's how they get to additionality. Just to get into more of the technical details here, the IAC looks at 6 types of risks stemming from sector, team, technology, market, regulatory environment, and company finances. I won't unpack all these categories right now. Obviously, you can read the case study to get into those weeds. They're useful weeds, but time is short. In addition to this expert input on risk profile, Prime staff also conduct what they call a circumstances of the round evaluation. This is where they interview company founders and investment managers to answer questions such as how long has the company been fundraising, what feedback have they received from investors, and what would happen if Prime doesn't invest. And again, this is all about figuring out what the case for additionality is. It's about determining whether Prime would be not just achieving impact, but achieving impact that likely would not manifest without Prime specific involvement. And then finally, Prime doesn't stop at the initial investment decision. They actively maintain and monitor additionality post-investment. So this here is a lineup of questions from a rubric that Prime uses, or at least was using when I was doing the research for the case study. And we see questions about risks of impact failure, actions that managers have taken, possible environmental harm, etc. And the answers to these questions enable Prime to provide necessary strategic guidance to the investee in order to maintain that value-added impact at the core of Prime's mission. Okay, lessons learned. So the case study wraps up with several lessons that the Prime team has learned through their experience implementing these processes and programs, and I'll just review them briefly here. The first is the need to accept ambiguity in assessing additionality. There's a lot of subjectivity here. The impact investing field is constantly evolving. So Prime has found that it really needs to continually reassess and update its understanding of the investment landscape to determine whether and how certain interventions can be genuinely catalytic. Second, flexibility is essential. Again, market conditions and investor appetites constantly change. What requires catalytic capital today might attract conventional investment tomorrow. So Prime needs to stay agile in their assessments. Third, Prime has had to rethink what success looks like in impact-first investing. So many impact investors are sort of shy about the trade-offs that come with prioritizing impact. But because Prime is so additionality focused, the organization understands and embraces those trade-offs. And that means recalibrating how to think about what makes an investment successful. And then finally, Prime has grappled with balancing rigor and efficiency. So their commitment to thorough additionality assessment is resource intensive. There's a lot of time and staffing that goes into it, and they're actively exploring ways to streamline processes while maintaining high standards. That can be, a delicate balancing act, and it's one that Prime is constantly managing. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up here. I don't want to trespass too much on the time that we have with actual Prime insiders. So I'm looking forward to switching over to a conversation with Anna and Jenny to unpack all of this. I guess just in closing, I'll say that I hope the case study shows that additionality shouldn't be just a conceptual box to check. It can be a core organizational value that shapes strategy, culture, and operations. And Prime's systematic approach, while resource intensive, offers what I think is a valuable model for what this can look like in practice to address the question that Mike posed, that he's heard from other stakeholders. How does this actually work in practice? I think the case study is instructive on that point. And especially as the urgency of climate action grows, Prime's framework really provides important lessons for the broader impact investing field. So thanks for your attention. Let's transition to a virtual fireside chat. Okay. So I think that, Peter, just to confirm, I'm going to continue to steer the ship here, right? Okay, great. So I'm joined by Anna and Jenny, who are just instrumental in getting this case study finished. So really excited to unpack it with both of them. But just for starters, Anna and Jenny, would you like to introduce yourselves?
Yeah, happy to. Thank you so much, Michael and Mike and Peter and team and everyone for being here. My name is Anna Goldstein. I'm the Chief Program Officer at Prime, and my home base is out in Western Massachusetts. I live in Amherst.
Hi, everybody. I am Jenny Zhang. I am the Assistant Director of Impact at Prime, and I lead additionality assessments. So really thrilled to nerd out on this topic with y'all today.
Wonderful. So we're going to go back and forth with some questions that I've prepared for 10 minutes or so, and then looking forward to opening it up to the rest of the room for a broader Q&A. But just for the more focused fireside chat, maybe we'll start with the relationship between additionality and other criteria. So as I said, additionality is absolutely central to Prime, but it's not the only thing that they think about. So there's a balancing act between additionality and impact potential and commercial potential. So Anna, how do you handle potential trade-offs among these three priorities?
Yeah, thanks for this question. I'll start by agreeing that additionality is extremely intertwined with the other criteria and requirements for Prime to achieve impact. The thing that ties all of these criteria together, the tool we use, is our theory of change. So I'm going to gesture and have our ultimate goal at the top of that theory of change, because then we work backwards to figure out what criteria are needed to feed that goal. And our ultimate goal is to crowd in commercial capital to deploying climate solutions at scale. So let me speak about the direct investing context and say, to achieve that, right, we need to know that three things are true. We need to make sure the company that is being funded is developing a climate solution that has truly game-changing potential impact, not just small tweaks. Two, we need to make sure that this company is plausibly the right one to get that climate solution to scale. It has to be able to eventually, we can imagine it succeeding in the market. And three, we have to make sure that the company wasn't already going to be funded. That's the concept we're talking about here. And that's so that we are never crowding out commercial investment. So in that logic chain, we definitely see trade-offs, and particularly on the commercial potential versus additionality.
Screenshot the other participants before we quit? No, I can download the recording. Okay.
Okay. Where was I? Oh, commercial potential versus additionality. So this is not unique to Prime. We see this kind of as a common experience across catalytic investors, but there is a range. There are companies that are, they have a lot going for them and they are almost there on the commercial front. So then we end up co-investing with a lot of commercial investors and having a very near-term crowding in effect, right? The other end of the range, some companies are carrying really significant risk on the commercial side. You saw the laundry list of risks we look at. But as a result of that, the additionality case is a slam dunk. Okay, so we're really confident in our contribution, and we expect that crowding in to take longer to materialize. So you asked about how do we handle trade-offs. So let me get specific and say we have to meet a minimum standard across all the criteria, right? That's for us to say this is good enough. And that's what's documented in the case study. But more generally, how we prioritize our time and resources, we're looking for at least one of those three criteria to not just be good enough, but to actually be really strong. And so we can then zoom out and look at how they all fit together and say, where is this really selling an absolutely crystal clear case for why this is a good use of charitable capital and why it's how Prime is going to achieve our mission.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Anna. And I want to switch over to the practical specifics of evaluating additionality, because as Mike said, this is something that lots of people think about and kind of puzzle over. And I think one of the clearest takeaways from the case study is that expert input is a major engine of that. So and specifically the IAC, the Investment Advisory Committee. So Jenny, can you share more details about the role of the IAC in additionality assessment?
Yeah, happy to. And I think the thinking here really is that the hardest thing in additionality assessments, and I might argue for all impact assessment, is establishing that counterfactual, right, of what would happen in the counterfactual without your intervention. And this is almost always kind of impossible to test because by definition, you're going down one path and you don't know what would have happened. So the IAC is really designed to help with that, establishing the counterfactual. At the very beginning of Prime's journey in catalytic investing and establishing additionality almost a decade ago, we designed the IAC to say, okay, here are all the climate investors active today. Let's get them all in the room. Let's see what they have to say about these companies and opportunities so that we know whether these companies could get funded by other climate investors or if Prime's capital is needed to really catalyze and propel these companies forward. Fast forward 10 years later, very joyfully, the field of climate investing has expanded so much that now it's virtually impossible to get every single climate investors together in the field, in the room together to create that counterfactual. So what we do now with the IAC is we look at them as representatives of the conventional climate investing space. And we have this saying on the Prime team that this is almost our petri dish where we experiment and test and see how this company would do, right, if it go out to market, how climate investors would react to them, what kind of response they would get. So for us in those conversations with IAC members, it's really not just their final verdict of, oh, do they think this company needs Prime support that matters. What also matters is just observing the conversation, seeing how they react. Sometimes it's, especially in the venture investing space, right, where that knee-jerk reaction is so important in determining how the trajectory of the fundraise could go. So having the IAC and presenting them the opportunity and seeing their reactions to those opportunities in real time gives us that lens of, okay, this is what could have happened if this company were to go out and raise from other investors. Now, like I said, it's not a perfect simulation of real life fundraising because we only have a very select a group of representatives and not the whole field. So what we do is that we treat the IAC input as one piece of the equation into the whole additionality assessments. And we try to complement this expert input with evidence we gather from what we call the circumstance of the round evaluation, where We see when the companies are actually out in the market fundraising, what reception they have and how what kind of difficulties or challenges they might be facing. And we take those two pieces of information together in making our assessment.
I think there's a really logical appeal to incorporating expert input into additionality assessment. But I think there's probably a delta between the appeal and the actual practice of getting expert input, because the temptation is thinking, oh, if we defer to the experts, we'll get the answer that we need. But of course, even experts disagree with each other. And so I can imagine at least scenarios where you poll the experts and the confusion or the ambiguity doesn't vanish. It just compounds perhaps. So could you share an example maybe of when additionality is not so clear cut even after you get the IAC's expert input, and how did you handle that situation?
Yeah, good question. And just to double down on your point, Michael, like experts can be wrong too, right? Prime, we've done some retrospective analysis on how accurate our IAC's assessments have been. And while the results were it's very great. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I think it's close to 75% of the times where they were right. But that also means that there are times where their feedback and input are wrong. To your question about a not so clear-cut additionality case, I mean, are there ever really very clear-cut additionality case anyways? I don't know. But in situations where things are especially tricky or sticky, we always just try to gather as much evidence and input as we can. So sometimes this might look like asking the company to go out and actually test the market more, to reach out to more investors and gather more input so we know how other investors are responding to them. Sometimes we'll also do additional interviews with either dedicated IAC members or other investors in the field, just to say, hey, here's this company, it has these types of risks that we think might make it a good fit for Prime's investment, but there are these other factors that might compensate or counterbalance the risk. What do you think in this situation? Gathering as much input as we can and as much evidence as we can to support our decision making is kind of what we try to do when situations are tricky. The other thing here is that, at the end of the day, you got to remember additionality assessments is a subjective judgment made by the assessor. So in situations like this, we also tend to lean into one of Prime's organizational values of humility, acknowledging that, we can get this wrong. It happens. And this is why for additionality, our threshold, it's not to say we need to be 100% certain that this is the right judgment, because we'll never be able to get to that 100% certainty bar. Instead, what we try to look for is this confidence level of around 75%, right? Or in Impact Frontiers language, looking for clear and convincing evidence that back our judgment and decision. And if we do make a mistake in a tricky case, that's okay. We learn from it and we know better next time on what to look for and what are the signs that might signal pass or no pass on additionality.
Well, I can certainly ask additional questions, but we're approaching the halfway point of our time together, and we have a full room. So I really just want to open it up now to anyone else who have their own questions. And I will do my best to monitor the chat and look for emojis and all of that. So fire away. Let me just look back at do we have any questions from before? I mean, I'm not sure who else is in the room, but I'm wondering if there's anyone here who has like a distinctly different approach to additionality assessment compared to what we've been talking about. It would be interesting to get a dialogue on that foundation. Anyone at all? Sarah, do you recognize anyone here who might have a different perspective? Oh, I see a hand. Okay. Larry, by all means. And you're on mute.
Thanks a lot for this presentation. I think is fascinating intellectually, but more important than that, more importantly, it's an impressive tribute to something that can actually be done in climate with great impact. One thing that would perhaps be useful would be is if you could go through a case study, like with a company that you kind of evaluated and went through this process and how that turned out, and how additionality, which is a tenet I strongly believe in, was a key hallmark of that process.
Yeah, I'm happy to take this one. Let's see. An example that's top of mind for me, and I won't say the company name just for, privacy purposes. Recently we had a company that comes through our diligence pipeline. And I should preface this by saying that for all of our diligences, we treat additionality with the same high rigor. Additionality is never more important in the case than other criteria or less important. So think of this as a representative, but with additionality being a little bit tricky here because we had to do some extra validation. So this company was very early stage, and because it was very early stage, when we brought it to the IAC members, everyone was like, whoa, this is so crazy early stage. Are you sure it's even ready for an investment? It will be even crazy early for someone like Prime or Zola to consider because it's so high risk and so early stage and just not ready yet. Which, according to our rubric, yep, this checks the box of high risk and might be a good fit for catalytic capital. But also during that same IAC meeting, some IAC members brought up the question of, while this is a very early stage and high risk company, there are certain attributes about it. For example, the team consists of the founding team has members who had successful ventures before or are highly regarded in the field. That might be the golden ticket or winning ticket for this company when it go out to raise from the market, so that other investors might be willing to overlook the fact that this company is early stage, has super high risk in its technology, and would just be willing to back it because of this star power effect of the founding member of the team. So that leaves us a real dilemma of, okay, we're kind of getting this mixed signal from IAC members and not knowing what the additionality case would be. So then when we talk to the company to gather the circumstance of the round evidence, the complicating factor there was that because this company was so early stage, they actually haven't done a lot of market testing yet. So they haven't reached out to a lot of other investors. And Azola was kind of one of the first investors it approached. So from that sense, we're like, okay, even though, on paper, from a risk profile perspective, this might be a fit, but we really need more evidence to substantiate that this is actually the case. So this is when we ask the company to go out and do more market testing. And then this is where we kind of run into that balance between rigor and efficiency again too, right? Because from the company's perspective, it's also not great to just go out and do a blast outreach to 50 investors that you don't know, because that risk ruining your relationship with them down the road, or just, starting off on the wrong foot with some investors. So it's a very delicate balance between, we need more market testing and market data to make a solid additionality argument on our end, but we also want to look out for the company to make sure that we're not putting them in a place where it might jeopardize their future success. So unfortunately, in this case, the company felt comfortable to reach out to more investors and get initial responses. So that was where we got a lot of good information validating that even despite the superstar power of the founding team of this company, other investors are still being hesitant about just how early stage and how much technology risk this company carried. So that combined with, we did another follow-up interview with the IAC member who brought up this risk in the first place. And we got their input on, okay, here's what we've heard from the company and their fundraising experience. Given all this and given your perspective, do you still feel like there is a good chance that this company could get funded by the conventional market. And this IAC member also said, okay, this makes a lot of sense, and it could be a good thing for Prime and Zola to support because of the risk profile here. So we ended up making a positive and affirmative assessment on additionality based on these additional information we gathered. And then that we resumed the diligence process for other criteria in that case. I hope that answers your question.
Wonderful. Sarah's given us a long runway of additional questions to plow through. So I'm happy to get into those, unless there's anyone else from outside Prime who has additional questions. This is a good opportunity to hear from Prime insiders on their special sauce.
I've got a question. Hi everyone, thank you for this. Super interesting. I'm curious how you think about funding something that in the subsequent round would still need some form of catalytic capital. Maybe the risk profile has changed. Is that something you're open to doing as long as there's like some movement and maybe opening up to some new types of investors? Or do you want to be a bridge to kind of market rate capital in the next fundraising round?
I can jump in on this one. It's a great question, and I'll go back to that Michael's question about trade-offs. And so in the case where we have an expectation up front based on the analysis, based on the input from experts, based on circumstances of the round, and we might think pre-investment, okay, this one's going to be a long runway. Commercial investment is probably several rounds down the road. Or we think like, actually, this is a very near-term opportunity and just needs that extra nudge to get over the hump, right? So let's go in clear-eyed from the start and be open to that range of possibilities. It needs to be a bridge to somewhere eventually, but the timeline of that could be short or long or in between. And then once things are going, post-investment, if it cleared the threshold, right? Things change all the time, especially if you're funding startups. Sometimes we do use the phrase a company graduating from additionality, and that's a moment to celebrate when they raise a round without catalytic participants. But the graduation analogy is actually not a good one, because sometimes then next round, they're back in school. I mean, things can come up that say, oh, this risk that we thought was temporarily resolved is actually still a core of the business, and the catalytic support is still what's needed. And at the same time, we're thinking about impact potential, so that things haven't changed, so drastically that we find out actually there's been emission drift and, the investment is additional, but it's no longer achieving our climate impact goals as an investor. So we need to keep tabs on both of those.
I can pop in, Michael, if that's helpful also, because I saw there was a great question also from Larry in the chat. Any insights on how additionality and other prime tenets would apply to nonprofit investing? It's such a great question. And the shorter answer is, sitting from the perch of Impact Frontiers that works with different communities of investors in different parts of the world and different sectors that may not see each other, we actually see these same principles manifesting independently in different places. In particular, often in the world of multilateral development banks and development finance institutions, in one place that there's actually a partner of ours called British International Investment, which is the United Kingdom's development finance agency, with whom we published a similar case study where they have developed a superstar approach to additionality, and we're willing to share it publicly. So I can share the link to that here. I know that we also have folks in the room from the land of community development finance institutions in the US. And we also see CDFIs in the US thinking a lot about additionality. And it's great to see them here. And I'm so glad that this can be a place where folks can cross-fertilize from different sectors who otherwise might not get to know each other.
Thanks, Mike. I'm not sure how you pronounce your first name. Rajan, is it?
Yeah, Regin is good. It's good enough. It's a French Canadian name, so Regin's fine. So thank you for this nice presentation. My question, I think it's more about the well, Prime is a non-profit organization, so I guess you're not there for returns and as a conventional investor would do. So in your mission, I guess that one of the success measures that you have is, like you mentioned, like the projects in which you're invested. How many of them graduate to the, let's say, big leagues, but also like you have the maybe two questions. The first one is one of those success measure is like, do you have a metric or somehow to measure like how many conventional investor you were able to bring in because of your presence in a deal? And the other one is, are you working with like, do you see recurrent conventional investors in your project? Like they see you coming in and they say, well, it might be a good opportunity for us to do the same kind of deal as the previous ones, and building that kind of community around Prime co-addition.
Okay, let me start. Those are two really good questions, and I want to invite Jenny to cover anything I miss. First of all, on the measurement aspect, this is really tough, and I don't think anyone has a perfect answer. I would really welcome others in the room who have tried doing this for their own practice to speak up. But the way we talk about it and are developing a measurement practice at Prime is around leverage ratio. And we would define that as in the numerator is the money that flows through Prime as a nonprofit. And in the denominator is starting at that moment when we invest, let's add up all the capital that comes in alongside into our holding and subsequently for the life of the holding. So a good thing there is that it's pretty straightforward to calculate and to explain. A downside, of course, is that we don't, again, to the unknowable counterfactual, we don't know which of those investors are also taking a catalytic strategy and might have come in without our intervention. So for us, leaning in, as Jenny said, to our value of humility, we don't want to be in the position of taking attribution for every company or fund's success forever and ever, and claiming that for Prime. But it is important to us internally that because of our process up front, we have high conviction that we were an important part of that story. And the metrics can be, a rough proxy for telling that story and what it meant for our charitable contribution relative to the rest of the capital being raised. So that's on leverage ratio. Oh, and your second question about repeat co-investors. Absolutely. We see this quite a lot, actually. And I'll take our venture capital programming as an example. It's like starting with Prime Impact Fund. That was a very experimental kind of edge of the frontier concept. Once that got going and folks in the climate tech field started to know Prime as, yes, Prime is seeking to de-risk, but also paying very close attention to commercial potential and finding those really good opportunities, then that becomes a reputation and can bring in the crowding in that much more effectively in the future. So that's the idea of the escalating effect to be catalytic, and specifically to not be a scarlet letter on the face of the company, right? So that they're not marked as a charity case for having had an investment from Prime.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess that your focus is, well, being mostly on climate tech, and it's might be because those are also like, because of the impact on climate, but also like the business case going forward is they will be at some point being able to generate like an interesting revenue enough to be by themselves in the standalone market without your presence. So you're not focusing on social projects or social impact. It's mostly on climate because it's easier to work the business case, right?
I hate to say easy, but I think you're right.
Well,
There's
yeah, it's
the
easy,
climate
let's say.
tech fields compared to other social cause areas. There are opportunities to make that business case. I agree.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, great. So we have a lineup here. We have Janet posed a question in the chat, and then we had Emily raise her hand, and then Daniel. Janet, did you want to voice in really quickly and unpack your question, or should I just read it off?
I can try. Thank you for this. This is great. I'm curious. So for folks who are really small, like DAF investors, so I'm trying to coordinate some DAF investors, and we don't have these kinds of resources. But I'm looking at potential kind of, I guess, shortcuts or leveraging research and folks who do have these resources to try and shortcut a way to additionality, like. If we have a trusted partner, say a debt financier, who's like, we really like this deal, but the risk profile just does not fit with us right now, we can't take them on. Is that good enough? Like, what's your reaction to that kind of approach?
Janet, I saw Sarah light up at your question. I wonder, Sarah, if you want to chime in, because I know that for philanthropists in particular, that is a question we've been getting a lot lately.
Thank you so much, Janet, for your question, and Anna for calling on me. You can tell we get this question all the time, Janet. You're not alone. And Michael referred to this earlier in his opening remarks, but what we are talking about here that Prime has done for our Prime built programs is very resource intensive. And we now have, over 10 years of learning by doing these very detailed additionality assessments and impact assessments. And at the same time, we've really gotten to know a lot of different types of philanthropists. Like you said, some are very large institutional foundations, but most are, people with a DAF. And I think one thing we are very excited about at Prime is having the infrastructure ourselves to support the field in a way that is beyond just advocating for our own programs. And so I'll just say, I think this is a set of functions that we as a field should not expect each philanthropist to build in-house. Like these costs can and should be shared as a field-wide resource where costs are shared across many, many philanthropists. And so that's something that we are very early in piloting. We started this year. And what we're thinking is, in addition to the Prime built programs that have always been the moniker of Prime, there's two other ways that we think a centralized hub of resources around additionality and impact assessment could be kind of brought to donors just like you. The first that we've done the most piloting so far is around what we're calling like Prime facilitated, where if you have something, as you said, that you see that you want to do, you can come to us and we'll do the additionality assessment for you. And if you need to, we can also do an impact assessment. And then what has been happening in that case is when donors are doing that with us, it's also helpful to have the nonprofit waterway for your DAF sponsor to then deploy into if you decide to proceed with making that catalytic investment. And so we just started doing that. We've made 3 investments so far. Because that has been so fruitful so quickly, we're now imagining that even if you don't want to use us as a waterway, we might be able to offer additionality assessments or impact assessments almost as a service on a one-off basis. So that's kind of Prime facilitated is that category. The other category that we're thinking about and kind of building toward offering is we get asked all the time by our own philanthropic partners who have already come into our programs. They're like, oh, I love Prime Impact Fund. I love Azola. Trellis is going, but I really like, of all of the catalytic investment opportunities in the world, I need a river guide to be like, what are the highest and best uses and why? And so this is where I think Prime's centralized hub of resources that can be where the cost can be shared across everyone is really helpful. We could actually like do the systems mapping research to work backward from all of the capital gaps and have a stance as an intermediary on what the highest and best uses might be, and then curate a prioritized list for all different types of donors. That was a much longer answer than what you asked for, but I hope it sounds like a dream to you. It does to us.
That's amazing. I definitely want to talk more with somebody about this.
Wonderful. Okay, so we have about 10 minutes. Emily had her hand up. So Emily, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, hi everyone, it's Emily. I'm with the Kissick Family Foundation, and I can attest to everything that Sarah just said as a funder, and who took advantage of many of those things and probably more of the services if they come. My question, I think, is for Anna. So let's say you have this incredible additionality approach and process for determining whether it meets your standard, and then this could apply for impact eval too. After you've made the investment, what is the process for then the circle back into making your assessments and decisions better? You make some investments, they work out, they were super additional and you feel great about them. You make others and they were quote unquote, not mistakes, but like they just weren't what you thought they were. Is it a meeting? Do you have other fancy things where you then take those insights and integrate them back into your decision making?
Emily, thank you for the great question. And that is a really important one that's actually too important for me to answer. I want to have Jenny chime in on this as the staff person who leads on our assessment work, because she referenced the data collection that we do. So we do know when things were off, when the decision was not to invest, we can observe whether what happened afterwards aligned with the why. In the decision to invest, of course, that's where we don't know the counterfactual, but it is really important to us to have that learning process, so we're always making our assessments better. So Jenny, I would love to pass it to you on that point.
Yeah, happy to share, Emily. This is probably a little less satisfying answer because we don't have a fancy process or beautiful structure for it. But the way it kind of works for us in practice is that we, as Anna said, for all the companies that our IAC members review, we do periodically look at what happens to those companies, especially if Prime or Zola decides not to invest in the end. And once we do that follow-up, it could be 6 months, it could be 12 months, depending on, to be honest, capacity at times. And then we see, okay, were they ultimately successful in raising, or were they not successful in raising, and what happened there? And after that retrospective analysis, that gave us more data on, okay, what happened, right? Was it a sector that we thought was really popular that ended up quickly losing investor interest, even in that time period after investment? If so, then we know that now, next time we see a company in that sector, let's do a double take on it and not just dismiss it so quickly. Or, is it that a company that we thought would need catalytic support but ended up being successful in raising? Then we kind of think about, okay, what made them special, right? Is it just they were lucky? Was it that they had connections that helped them with the fundraise, or was there something else? And whatever like points we pick out of there, then we kind of just also know in the back of our minds in future analysis to watch out for that. And as you heard in Michael's presentation, as in the case study as well, additionality, it's always evolving, it's always changing. it's something that we're also constantly learning too, right? And part of it, it's also just about building muscle memory. Prime has the privilege of doing this work for more than a decade. So there's a lot of muscle memory and institutional knowledge that gets passed down in doing this. So each generation of analysts come in with better and better pattern recognition skills and abilities, but also to reflect, to be responsive to the change in the market. You also kind of have to learn as you go and to make sure that you're not just relying on stale and old information and you're keeping up with the field.
Super helpful and incredibly impressive that you're tracking the investments that you did not make as well to learn from those too. That is something I would not have considered otherwise.
Okay. So maybe we can wrap up with Daniel's question.
Yeah, I'll be quick. And I just want to say thanks to everyone who's chimed in. This has been a really great conversation. I'm curious, just quickly, if you guys ever consider additionality in terms of other catalytic investors. So if there are other catalytic investors looking to be additional and there's a few circling one specific deal, how do you consider that, right? Because if you take that to the extreme, then no one's investing in some of these deals. So I'm curious how you think about that.
Jenny, please.
I was going to offer to chime in first, Anna. The short answer is we think about not just Prime or Zola's additionality, but rather we think about, does this opportunity need support from catalytic investors, any catalytic investors? It could be us, it could be other philanthropically motivated funders or other, capital sources. We don't care which one it is, but really what's really important for us is to make sure that we're not crowding out conventional capital, but rather we're crowding them in. Kind of to Michael's point about redefining what success means to us, right? We're not chasing the hottest deals. We don't have to make the investment and get the return to call it a success. For us, what's really successful is to know that there is this really impactful company, and without us or some other catalytic sources, they would have struggled to generate impact. But with this support, they're now on that path that Anna described to getting more capital, getting more scale, and then delivering that impact into the world. And that's what we think success is. So really for us, if another funder, maybe better resource catalytic funders can step in and support the company, then we say that's awesome, that's great, we celebrate that, that's a win for Prime as well.
Thanks, Jen.
I'll give a little coda to that just because I agree with everything Jenny just said, and I'll extend it to say it also applies to how we think about, investing in companies that have grant support, a government grant that maybe in a time when government grants are going to climate solutions, then that still doesn't mean that we have to shy away from that area, right? Because that's all the more capital that's impact prioritizing, philanthropy, government, or otherwise, and going to great things in the world. So we're happy about that. And just coming back to Michael's point about additionality as the animating principle for Prime, we're also looking at ways that we are being additional in a broader sense, right? So we're happy if the amount of capital flowing, is neutral in that impact prioritizing sense. But we're even happier if we're finding that, Prime is making it even easier for a donor to participate in catalytic investing, and so increasing overall those total flows of capital. And that's sort of where Sarah's going in speaking about our expanding platform, is trying to really bring more people and more dollars to this movement.
Okay. Well, I don't think we have any more questions. So thanks for your attendance and attention and questions. And I'll just encourage you to take a look at the case study if you haven't already, and you know who to follow up with if you have any more questions.
Thanks so much, Michael. And from Impact Frontiers, just want to thank the Prime team. And I'm so glad that everybody here was as impressed with them as I am. Thanks all for joining.
Bye, everyone.